um,
I just realized I wasn't recording. Can you say your idea all from the beginning, Risa, for this, if you don't mind?
okay, I'll try. So,
I'm
wait, what are
sorry
we
about that.
talking about again here? So, right, so the theological and or ecological implications of the cosmos being created in the image of God, right? So, my question is that our language is temporal, but when we talk about God, we're talking about the eternal and the infinite. So when we say that the cosmos is created in the image of God, there's an implicit indication there that God created the cosmos.
Right. Did that make sense, Deborah?
Getting there. I mean, now thinking about language and language being temporal, you know, the interesting thing about Hebrew and Hebrew roots is they're so deep and they often contain their opposite and kind of capture in a way that sense of both temporal and eternal. I mean, and so do blessings. I mean, there's this thing in the Hebrew mindset that sort of really captures what you're saying well that I think is totally missing in English. I'm talking about, like, even the word olam, right? Which I translate as space-time continuum, but it has the idea that not only olam is not only the revealed world, but elam, it's what's mysterious or not revealed, or perhaps what's revealed emerges out of that unrevealed world. So deep in the Hebrew language, and not very apparent in English.
Sure. That's a whole interesting area of questioning. Does the structure of the language indicate the metaphysics of the culture?
Yes.
And to what degree can we rely on the structure of language to teach us about the metaphysics of the culture? For sure, the tenses, just even talking about verb tenses in Hebrew, function in particularly in the biblical text, radically different ways. I mean, over time, rabbinic culture and then modern culture developed ways of finessing the Hebrew to indicate more typical modern tenses, modern English tenses. But it's not built into the language. And that gets into the question of eternity and what eternity means, what temporality means. But aside from that abstract question, that idea, by the way, is called linguistic relativity. Aside from that more abstract question, does the universe being in God's image tell us that the universe is subsequent to God, that God is prior to God, to the creation? And I think in most ways of thinking about it, the answer would be yes, although it's not necessarily the case, because it could be that two things are the image of each other. And in fact, even though we wouldn't say that about the universe per se, there's quite a bit of talk, not in the temporal sense, but in the ontological sense, in Kabbalah specifically, about the idea that God is the image of humanity, and not just the humanity is the image of God. Does that make sense? Part of that is the way that Kabbalah likes to mix up metaphysics in order to make it more mysterious, as we've talked about a few times. Just to fill in for everyone, we're on chapter 9. I forgot to record the beginning of this class. And what we've read is we've read the first paragraph on page 241 and are discussing it, and specifically this line: the idea that the universe as a whole is in the divine image has profound ecological and theological ramifications. So we were talking about what are the theological and ecological, and as Deborah mentioned before I remembered to turn on record, the ethical implications of that. So actually, let me go back to you, Deborah, and you can restate that for the recording, if you don't mind.
Okay. So if the universe is created in God's image, is in the image of God, then that means that it's holy, and that requires a certain kind of it requires being raised to understand one's place in that. You know, the whole relationality. What does it mean to be in relationship with all that is, and to have it characterized by respect, and only use things with permission, like, which I understand is part of the basis of the blessing system, and with the notion that you're using something for the good of the whole.
Right.
Not to do it unless you are. So we mentioned that a time or two ago. The precautionary principle, I think, is what that is in ecology, right? Or it's related to that.
In ethics in general, there's a precautionary principle that people talk about. Yeah. This raises an issue that was just on my mind and just flew the coop. So we'll have to come back to it when I think of it. Yeah. Risa, did you want to say something? Was that a hand up? No. Okay. Good. What was I going to say? Ethics. Oh, yes, I remember. There's a way in which the rest of creation is already in the flow of that holiness, so that an owl will use mice by eating them,
Right.
but it doesn't have to ask permission.
Right.
Because it's part of the flow of divine energy and plan in a way that humans are not or don't understand ourselves to be. Yeah, and I'm just pointing that out because it creates some interesting
So it reminds me of
problems.
a story from Reb Zalman where he used to talk about being a kosher butcher, telling the chicken, you know, I can't remember the exact words, but telling the chicken that I'm going to kind of, you're going to now participate in human consciousness. You know, you're going to give your life. I'm going to kill you, but it's for the purpose of then being able to be incorporated into a human being and participate in human consciousness.
Right. I just want to point out how that kind of asking permission or offering some kind of benefit is almost exclusively a human fantasy.
Say more about the fantasy part.
I think we would be hard pressed to find a chicken would be able to tell us whether it wanted to get killed so that it could become incorporated into human consciousness, which we can't do. But if we could, it's hard to imagine a chicken saying yes.
No,
even though, what's that?
I understand.
Yeah.
I mean,
as Jim, you remember Jim Sinclair, who joined us last week, was pointing this kind of thing out when he was pushing a more vegan perspective. But that story is important for how we give ourselves permission, which is by telling a story about being given permission.
Or Native Americans, you know, the ritual of the hunt, and then, well, it's similar, that using every part of the animal, first of all, and then second of all, that the animal is being incorporated into the characteristics of the human, you know, that they try to make it sacred.
I mean, when you make generalizations like that about Native American culture, I'm conscious of the fact that we're not talking about a specific culture, and therefore,
right? Yeah, and I can't
maybe playing in a way that's appropriation that we might want to be thinking about. But, and I also want to push against this idea of using every part of the animal. It's necessarily true that anything that's a natural process uses every part of the animal. What's different about what people frequently in Western civilization, but I'm sure in other cultures as well, do, is that they don't just not use every part, but there's parts that they don't use, they dispose of in a way that makes them not used by anything else as well.
Yeah, like the water you were talking about.
Right, right. So if you take what's left of the animal and or use it in a way that's explicitly denigrating to the recognition that that was an animal is another way that we so I don't think it's true. Well, put it this way. In most slaughterhouses, I'm pretty sure they find a way to use every part of the animal because they want to make money and that's what they care about. And if they can find a way to use it, they will use it. So it's not about whether they use or not. It has so much to do with the intention and the way in which that use is incorporated into real human life as opposed to capitalism.
I agree.
Susan?
I mean, I have concerns. I do completely believe that the universe was created in God's image, and we are in God's image, and the universe is in God's image, and all of that. But it seems to me that carrying this discussion to its logical conclusion means that I, as a human being, am kind of outside of the natural order, that only the natural order is natural, and that humans are not somehow, and that the owl doesn't ask permission of the mouse, because the mouse would likely say no thank you to the predetermination of its end. So it just seems to me that we actually can't do anything from the natural, from the extension of this argument. So I have problems with it going that far. Full disclosure, I do eat meat, and I'm very careful and cautious about where I get it from, so that I source it only from places where I know where it was raised and how it was raised and who raised it and how it met its demise, and it's not slaughterhouses. But there's something about this, I'm just not that pure. And so how do I fit into this cosmology?
Yeah. That is the problem with this question, with this issue, which is what I was meaning to raise initially, that it is inherently puts humans outside of the system. And in fact, saying that the universe is in God's image because...
I don't understand what it is that puts humans outside of the system.
Because we see ourselves as needing to ask permission, because somehow we're not just in the divine flow of governance. If we were simply part of the divine flow the way an owl was, then we would take as we needed, as according to our instincts and bodily needs, and give back according to the needs of the ecosystem in which we're part of, including giving back our bodies.
Well,
and that would happen naturally. It wouldn't really be possible for us to go outside what were the holy boundaries.
I'm saying unconsciously rather than using the word naturally, because I think the split is on some level learned or cultural, or could have been trauma-based learning, to see oneself as not part of nature.
Right. I'm using the word naturally on purpose, but also in quotes. So I think we're on the same wavelength about that,
yeah, okay.
More or less. So
I think
of course,
it's not remembering ourselves. We forget that we are a member, so hence we have to have the practice of remembering.
One of the implications of this idea that the universe is in God's image, if we get to it the way the Kabbalists do, which is that the universe is in God's image because the universe is in the image of the human being, is that the human is different inherently from the rest of creation because it's similar to the rest of creation all by itself. So that the human is in the microcosm of the cosmos. And that's not seen as being true of the rest of the parts of creation. Only the human part is the part that is the full image of the full cosmos. Got that? I'm not saying whether that's true or not true, or even what it means for it to be true, only that's the logic that's used to get there.
Doesn't that depend on everything else being a part of us?
It does, exactly. And that's where the ecological dimension becomes so important, And something that I want to bring out here, which we haven't touched on yet. So it's not just that the universe is in the image of God, but that we are in the image of the universe, that somehow everything in the universe is reflected in us, and our having part of it in ourselves implies a responsibility to every other part. That isn't true about the owl or the mouse or the fern or the pear tree.
We're also capable of doing the most harm, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
So it would
It's just it's actually just a kind of complicated system to try to figure out how does it work. But going back to what Risa was pointing out, that saying that the universe is in God's image puts ontological priority, the priority of existence, on God as creator of the universe. That's also true by about saying that the humans are in God's image, except that no one would make the outlandish claim that humans are somehow prior to creation or to God, at least not in our religion. I think that it's possible that other religions might make that claim, specifically Gnostic religions. What's that?
We have something, it's not exactly that, but isn't there, like, some Midrash talks about how everything, like the Torah is a blueprint of everything, and God looked into the Torah in order to create the universe.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so in that sense, you know, there is a way that also that everything predates creation in some paradoxical.
Yeah, let's just play with a few texts here, because right now we're kind of talking, we're floating in the air a little bit.
Okay.
And maybe being overly abstract, I think perhaps, which is not always a problem, but too much of it is a problem, for sure. So here we have some of the roots for this idea. So the first idea is that the human is an olam katan, a small world. And the origins of that actually go back to something we've already studied, which specifically, I think it was in chapter 3, but that the human is an olam maleh. Every individual, one who saves an individual human life, it's as if they saved an olam maleh, a full world, which in later texts gets transformed into an olam katan, a small or miniature world. So the roots of that, here we're looking at one of the earlier texts, Kohelet Rabbah. Rav Barachia said in the name of, am I sharing? Yes, I am sharing, okay. Said in the name of Rav Shimon ben Lakish, whatever the Holy One created in the human, he created in the world as a model for him. A person has a head and so does the earth, as it says, and the head of the dirt of the world. A person has eyes and so does the earth, as it says, and they will cover the eye of the earth. That's a reference to the plague of locusts. And it goes through all the different body parts. And it's hard for me to say that this has any ethical or metaphysical significance, this kind of text. It seems like to me like it's just, I mean, I'm interested in counter arguments. It seems to me that it's just kind of fooling around textually and maybe having fun. But I'm not sure that it has any ethical implications. Here's another example from Avot Rabbi Natan. All that the Holy One created in the earth, God created in the human. The Holy One, blessed be for all time. Oops, I went one page too far. And for all eternity of eternities in wisdom and understanding created the whole world, and he created the heavens and the earth, upper ones and lower ones. Remember how important that language is for our general questions of ecology. And he formed in the human whatever he created in the world. Now, one of the essential aspects of this idea that what's in the world is in the human being is that it's not just the physical earthly world, the tachtonim, but also the elyonim that are created in the human being, which is related to the Kabbalistic idea that we create a funnel or a channel between the heavens and the earth, or between the invisible worlds and the physical worlds to allow blessing to flow. Now that's a Kabbalistic idea that's not going on in Avot Rabbi Natan, but Avot Rabbi Natan is the foundation for that idea. So it's not just the foundation for an idea that the universe is in God's image, it's the foundation for all of Kabbalistic ethics entirely. As I point out in the book, the first time Olam Katan is used, though, that particular language is only in Tanchuma, in Pekudei. We have this. I already mentioned the Mishnah Sanhedrin text here, but here's the Tanchuma one. The Mishkan weighs equal to the whole world and equal to the structure of the human, who is a small world. So even though this idea seems to be fundamental in rabbinic thought, it takes multiple centuries before it gets articulated in a form that can provide the basis for what Kabbalah does. And that itself is an interesting fact. What we're talking about are ideas that we can express in a few sentences that took 500 years to develop, or 1,000 years to develop, for whatever reason. I brought in the book some texts from other religions that also talk about the relationship between the human and the cosmos that I thought were interesting. It's not just a Jewish idea, and actually it's more likely that the idea did not come from Judaism, but that Judaism adopted it from a different cultural tradition, although we don't know the roots, or we can't trace it back to be more accurate. Let me pause a second. Does anyone have questions or issues or ideas that they want to raise right now?
Well, I was wondering whether the all this pointing out the connections, like humans have this and the earth has this. To me, it sounds like it's pointing out relationship or striving for relationship and connection in some way. Because I know when I meet people, I'm always looking for what I have in common to try to make that connection.
What is at stake for these rabbinic texts? I'm not sure that I agree with you, Deborah. That would make sense. I can't tell from the text itself what is at stake for the people writing it. And I find that puzzling.
That's an interesting question, yeah.
Why did it matter to them to say this? I mean, it could be very simply that they wanted to fit into a broader cultural phenomenon. You know, if you want to be very reductionist about it, I don't think that would be a meaningful or a sufficient explanation. But it could be that that's one of the things happening. What is interesting is that, especially, no, this is the wrong way to put it. Something that is interesting to me, one of the many things that are interesting to me, is that this idea gets filled in with more and more meaning over time. So that by the time we get to the 13th century or the 14th century, we have finally, after that many centuries, someone saying, the universe is the image of God.
Well, to what extent is it experiential for them? I mean,
that's an excellent question. I don't know how to answer that question.
Because are these coming out of spiritual experiences?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it just an intellectual exercise, kind of like sometimes the Talmud seems to be?
Yeah, does anyone know how to answer that question? If we had someone writing about their spiritual experience from a certain time, that would give us something to go on. We don't have those kind of books from that far back. People didn't write that way, mostly.
David?
Yes.
Could it be something like it's a visual language, so they had a visual experience?
Mm-hmm. It could be.
That didn't make sense, and the only way to describe it was this way?
I mean, that's one way to interpret something we're not talking about in this chapter, but was discussed earlier in the book, which is the literature that's about the vision of God's body, quote unquote body, the Shir Koma, and mysticism about the vision of the chariots. where it's for sure seems to be describing a visual mystical experience. And yet, even in that context, there becomes a textual cliche, maybe you could put it, of talking that way, so that maybe there's one text that talks that way and another text that talk that way because they are imitating the first text and elaborating on it, and not necessarily because they're having an experience of it. And so how do you tell when someone is elaborating textually versus reporting experience? And because everything of this nature tends to be commenting on things like the book of Ezekiel and Ezekiel's vision, for example, of the chariot, which is the source of all Merkava mysticism, it is possible that all of it is a textual elaboration of Ezekiel rather than a description of experiences. I don't think that's likely. I think it's likely that they were also seeking visual mystical experiences, the way you're imagining it. But there's still no way to know for sure. It's just a curious, interesting fact. Like for us, when we talk about the universe being in God's image, I don't think, is it for anyone a visual experience when we talk about it that way? Probably not, am I right?
Well,
It's more of a,
depends what you mean by visual, because, you know, I've had dreams where I saw things that made me feel that way.
mm-hmm.
It was in a dream state. Sometimes a little bit, you know, occasionally awe breaks through in the waking state, or, you know, something that would.
But the word you used, I think, is so important. It may or may not have a visual component, but it's about what it makes you feel, not about what you're seeing. So when I think about the universe as being in God's image, I don't first think about the fact that the fact that there is a theological belief that I'm in God's image.
Right.
I think about the universe as having priority. The universe's image of God is having priority to anything I might think about myself or other people. And that does actually exactly what Risa was talking about before for me, which is it emphasizes for me the priority of the universe over my own sense of existence. And so it puts me in a position of humility rather than in a position of aggrandizement. But it could easily go the opposite way. It's all dependent on the feeling, which is not circumscribed by the text.
Well, for me, it leads to that sense of membership or belonging and responsibility, and that the two are so connected that it's hard to tease them apart.
Right. So then here's a question. It's an experiential question, if you all can get at it, although it still is a little bit abstract. If you like close your eyes and you think about God and the universe being the full image of God, so that anything you can know about God, you can know by reflecting on the universe. So when you imagine universe, you imagine being in God's presence in a very strong way. That gives you certain feelings, certain sense of yourself in relation to the whole. If you then add in, and that image is in myself, and in my neighbor, and in that stranger, it's the interaction of those two levels that creates the ethics on some level. Does that make sense? So that I can feel that awe. I write about this in other places in the book. I can feel that awe in relation to the universe, and then the next step would be to look at a human, any other human being, or look at myself and feel the same awe, the same level of awe, and then experience what that means ethically. How does that put me in relationship to the other person or to my own self? Can I feel awe in relation to just trying to comprehend even just my own self? And this gets to the unconscious, which Diana was talking about, right? because what's true is that when we look at the universe, what is perceivable is much greater than what's visible, and what's imperceivable is much greater than what's perceivable. And that's also true even of myself, even though I am a finite circumscribed being with a beginning and an end and a certain volume and a certain weight. Even with all those limitations, it's still true that the invisible levels of what I am and who I am are far greater than anything that could be conscious or knowable. So to imagine that can even be overwhelming emotionally, and certainly both empowering and humbling at the same time.
And scary, and can kind of put you back to sleep, the overwhelm.
Yes, yes. It's a little much to try to carry around every day, all the time. I think I've never been able to do that. There might be some mystics who can do that. I don't know.
Well, people talk, or Susan, what is her name, who wrote about the Rebbe, you know, who wrote about the Chabad Rebbe who died.
Mm-hmm.
She writes, the way she describes him and being around him is the way people describe being around, you know, say, who they consider enlightened Hindu gurus, you know, the kind of energy he had, the kind of attention he had,
Mm-hmm.
the kind of economy of movement that he had. I mean, she writes a really beautiful piece about him. And it seems like, and he didn't need a lot of sleep. And it seems like people on that level perhaps are able to sustain that for way longer than, you know.
That awareness, you mean?
Yeah, the awareness, and live in it and live from it.
What's interesting is that when people have that kind of inspired relationship or inspiring relationship to another figure, a guru figure or a Rebbe figure, they look to the Rebbe to be reminded of that reality. And they seem to inculcate a need to see the Rebbe in order to see that, as opposed to seeing their fellow Shlamazel next to them and
Right.
seeing that same thing.
Well, it's a step. I mean, you know,
It's a step, yes. It's a step, but you see that that's actually the way idolatry can work its way into
yeah,
things.
I get it. I get it. I mean, I've been all over the map on this question.
Right. So then the next question that comes up for me in this reflection is, to what degree, when we limit that kind of reflection to seeing other human beings, to what degree does that end up being an idolatry because we don't extend it to the world around us? But if you say that the reason why we get there is because we see creation as being the image of God and then us in the image of creation, then you have to start with extending it to the world around us. And therefore it changes the ground of ethics. As we were talking about, the ecological and the theological implications of that idea, the more we take it seriously, the more it revolutionizes how we think about ethics. So the ethical ground of everything is not the human being and the value of the human being, but the creation and the value of creation. And that the value of the human being is grounded in the value of creation. And when we start that way, there's a lot of different things that happen that might not happen otherwise. That can be very powerful. Yeah. Am I talking too abstractly, or are you following me?
I'm right with you.
Everyone else?
Yeah, I like to make. Oh, go on, Rihanna.
No, I'm trying to follow. I'm getting part of it, but not the whole, but it's okay. It's
Okay.
a challenge.
I like to make fun of myself by saying Formica has feelings. Probably everyone here knows what Formica was.
Plastic?
Well, yeah, it used to be used for countertops.
Yeah.
But I mean, if we assume sentience, how can we go wrong?
Yeah.
Does anyone want to answer that? How could we go wrong if we assume sentience? Is there an answer to that? Anyone?
Well, being paralyzed into not being able to do anything.
That's one possible problem. Any other problems anyone can think of?
Oh, idolatry, worshiping things, making them.
You'll never know. You'll never know whether it is or not.
A huge problem would be legal rights.
If everything is equally in God's image, how do you decide what you can use and can't use? That's something that we started out with, right?
So, I mean, I know people say to me, "Oh, you're killing insects when you're driving, so, you know, what's the big deal that you're not eating meat because you're killing these insects?" But it's inadvertent harm. So, I mean, not to make myself crazy, just I try to proceed with deference to all that is, whether it's a rock or something synthetic.
Right. But does anyone think about that when they're driving? I mean, I know I do. Sometimes.
I think
Well,
about the squirrels that run across the road. I don't think about
Exactly.
the insects. I have
No,
to
I
say.
definitely,
Because I
it
can't
depends,
see
but
them.
I know yesterday I was driving and there was a moth and I felt sad that I didn't think of like just swerving just a little bit, because, you know, if it's right in the center of your car, you don't really, you can't really do anything about it. But what if it's right on the edge, and if you just swerved a little bit? I do think that sometimes. I also know somebody who swerved to not hit a deer and died from it.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So that's not a, it's not a small thing to, that people might take risks like that are not, that we ethically would agree should never be taken.
He also might have died if he hit the deer too. They're pretty big.
Yes, I think that's true. It's possibly true, but it's also knowing this person. I would imagine him swerving not because of being afraid of the crash, but because he wanted to save the life of the deer, because that's the kind of person he was. So,
Well, that's the other question then, isn't it? Relativity. That comes out of that. So to preserve the life of the deer, he lost his own.
But he would have never, I mean, of course, he would never have made that choice on purpose. He didn't, it wasn't his intention for anything like that to happen, obviously, God forbid. It's just, so many things can get so complicated so quickly. And that was a tragedy that affected so many people.
Was that how David Wolfblank died?
No, I don't know why he went off the road, but I never heard any story about it having to do with something like that. I just don't know. I actually moved to Seattle shortly after that happened. So I heard a lot about his passing, but I didn't hear anything about the specifics, about that kind of specific. Yeah. People know David Wolfblank did the Medicidor, and he did a lot of work integrating and kind of mixing and matching Eastern spiritualities and deep Jewish knowledge. Some quite remarkable work, and a lot of it was very eclectic and almost manic, I would say.
Amazing.
Overwhelming in its beauty and in its extravagance in a way.
What I experienced studying him and his stuff is what I experienced studying this with you.
That's a very high standard. So,
well, it's really hard to find. I mean, well, it's hard to find, but then when you find it, you can stumble into a lot of it.
Indeed, yeah.
So thank you. I only wish that I could afford to pay you anything close.
Oh, please do not worry about that.
I do worry about it.
And I ask you not to.
Well, I will teach as much of this as I possibly can to pay it forward.
That's great. That makes me any more happy than anything you could.
I mean, this has just been like, this has been the blessing, one of the major blessings out of the curse of this COVID time.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Let's do more text here before we get totally lost in the weeds of our brains.
Oh.
I'm going to go to this one, which I'm not actually sure if this is going to be relevant. So this is as they may call it, a crapshoot. You see what comes out of this text. Okay. What is, and you laid your palm upon me. At first, the human was created from the earth to the firmament. But when the ministering angels saw him, they said, there are two dominions, one in the heavens and one in the earth. There's the God of the heavens, that's you, God, and there's the God of the earth. That's the human being. So what did the Holy One do? The Holy One had to do something to make it clear that humans were not so great or not so special, or certainly not creator, and God made the human to be smaller than the earth. From being as big as the whole planet to being only 100 cubits high. Now 100 cubits is roughly, I don't know, 150 feet tall, something like that.
Right.
So still big.
Well, that would be an ecological problem right there. The
Yes,
size
it would.
of human.
Here, I want to compare this with a different text. Where is it? Is it in the previous page? I'm going to tell it from outside the text. I don't think we need the text, which is that when God created the human being and stood him upright, it's in the masculine, but remember that from Midrashic perspective, the first human can also be male and female. So stood it upright. The animals looked at the human being and said, look, that's our creator. And they went to worship the human being.
Oh.
Now notice in this Midrash, the animals can see the human. They don't see God separate from the human. They don't see two dominions. They only see one dominion, and it's the human that appears to be the God of that world. And in that Midrash, God doesn't have to do anything to diminish the human, because it's the human that says to the animals, I'm not the creator. Come with me and we will go to worship the creator together. That Midrash a little bit gives me the tingles, I have to say.
Mm.
You know, the one that's here on the page, it takes the idea of the human being as big as the universe. It shifts it to being human as big as the earth, because the human only goes up to the firmament, but not past. And then it takes it as just a little like moral lesson. It doesn't have a deeper metaphysical meaning.
Mm.
Yeah. So that's one way to look at it. The other is that the greatness of the human being is a threat to creation, because it misdirects the energy of the animals. But it's also a boon to creation, because the human has the capacity to invite the animals to join in something even more important, even greater. And so in the first Midrash, the one on the page here, it doesn't really have direct ecological implications. Although I think, who had just said that would be a problem? Deborah, you said that, right? That would be an ecological problem. It does have some implications if we want to read into it. That is that humans have the capacity to be this large, but if we are that large, and that could be on a metaphysical or a self-image level, it's destructive of God's relationship even to the angels itself. And so we need to be diminished, which can also be interpreted as we need to diminish ourselves in order to
There's
be
the
in the right
right
balance.
size for us somehow,
Yeah.
and to figure out what that is.
But what's great about the animal Midrash is that it suggests we don't need to make ourselves less in order to be in harmony with the rest of creation.
Yeah.
What we need to do is be open to relationship. And as soon as we become open to that relationship and its potential, and what we can do to help realize its potential by being and doing in that way, we fix our ecological problem. Yeah. Because we reorient our power to be not about us, but about what can we create together beyond ourselves.
Well, David, when this was written, or the people, the community, they would only hear one midrash, right? We have the advantage.
Oh, I don't think we could say that. I don't know the answer.
I don't know. Okay, but okay.
This is a relatively early midrash.
Okay.
Let's see,
I'm
where's,
thinking of the balance that you're putting in and the different points of view.
mhm.
If the people were listening to the Rebbe, would they be getting both a many midrash or just what the Rebbe said?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I could answer that, and I don't think it's singular.
Yeah.
Depend on the Rebbe, wouldn't it? Don't you think?
I don't know. I would think if the Rebbe had a story that an interpretation that was his, that he liked. I don't know.
I think in terms of how rabbis deal with texts, it's an interesting and complicated relationship. And people have their favorites, and they have their ideas that are their favorites, and they pick the ones that express their ideas. One of the problems, which is also part of the beauty of rabbinic tradition, is that you get to pick the text you want to teach. And it's very easy to skew the tradition and say, this is Judaism, and ignore all of that. I think that there's no rabbi and probably no learner that doesn't do that. I know in my book, I try to quote texts that are anti-ecological as well in order to show the spectrum. But even then, clearly, obviously, I have a strong preference for a certain kind of text, and I hold it up and say, this is the one we should pay attention to.
Well, and your ethic for that is really important, which is what is going to best serve the flourishing of creation, you know.
Yes. But what's also true is that the text that goes against my ideas of what should be is also teaching us something important about human nature and the relationship to God. And we might need to figure out what that is and not just cast it aside.
I agree.
Yeah.
And that's always an interesting challenge, especially pick the text you dislike and what lesson can you learn from it? I mean, what's the text that's most like that for you? This is definitely a digression, but I think a meaningful one.
The one we have the most trouble with, the one we dislike the most.
It could be something big, or it could even be something small. So not the most, but just anything that you dislike enough that it comes to mind.
I'm thinking of when I learned about Christianity not caring about the earth, that the people think about the afterlife, and so the life here doesn't have that much implications. It was hard to apply ecological principles to somebody who's only caring about the afterlife.
Right. So that's a conceptual idea, but there are texts. Now, none of those texts are in the Torah.
Right.
Is there a particular text that comes to mind? There doesn't have to be, but is there one?
Well, look at the chat, because Gio has put some stuff.
Yes, I was going to mention what Gio and G have to say about that. But first, I want to figure out a bit more about Nayana's thought before we do that.
I'm not sure because I don't know that many texts, and I have chosen. I'm not sure. I read what I.
Don't worry about your rewards and punishments here, because you'll be rewarded in the world to come. That's similar to what you were saying.
I don't know about that as a text.
Yeah.
Well,
I want to say is I think the texts that talk about the afterlife can be, the idea of afterlife can be used in exactly the way Nayana is talking about it. As far as texts that say something like, that's what matters and not the planet and not the earth, Rabbinic Judaism is actually pretty good at making sure that stays complex. It's not perfect, and that problem exists with that idea. Even if you say all the right things, just having that idea creates the problem that Nayana is alluding to. But I can't think of a text, just off the top of my head, that really has that kind of one-sided emphasis. And I think that's one of the strengths of Rabbinic Judaism, is that it keeps that very complex. Now, the two things that we've had mentioned here, and now three things, that are Torah ideas. From Gio, is G Greg? I'm not sure if G is Greg. from Gio and G and from Susan are all the kind of Torah texts where the rabbis really mush them up so they don't have that meaning anymore that they seem to have on the surface. Right? I'm not sure I understand G's comment, but what G's example is harassing the Midianites, which is a good example. Because it's not just harassing, it's like they caused you to sin, so now go out and wipe them all out.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of several examples in which genocide appears to be presented as the will of God, which is horrific. And the second example from Gio is the same, the idea of killing Amalek, destroying Amalek. Let's stick with those two because they're so similar for the moment. Pinchas and the praise he gets is directly related to this idea of wiping out the Midianites and what that means. So the rabbis did what they could to reinterpret these things so that they, one, became impossible to apply in any real world situation. And two, became much more complex even in the context of the text itself. So they furnished us with models to hack the files, as it were, to hack the system files a little bit. And so that's good. In fact, a lot of what they did to hack these ideas, to use a Warren metaphor, to hack these ideas in the Torah is the kind of thing that I feel like we can do in hacking those ideas that are in Rabbinic Judaism in the same way. That is, you don't erase them, but you play with them until they transform into new meanings. So a good example is the one from Amalek, and I'm going to use the example of what Rav Kook says about it as a beautiful paradigm. So it says that in the commandment, you will destroy Amalek mitachat hashamayim, from under the heavens. And what Rav Kook says about this, and of course we're talking about a modern commentator. We need this kind of complexity to go all the way back. But Rav Kook gives a very full, meaningful example of it. What it means to destroy them from under the heavens is a suggestion that when you go above the heavens, you no longer need to destroy them. So what does it mean to go above the heavens? That then becomes the invitation to think about, right? So there's a way in which he talks about understanding sort of the spark of Amalek in its highest spiritual root. When you lift that up, this might be my interpretation as opposed to what he actually says, so I don't remember at the moment. But when you lift up that spark of Amalek to its root, this is a common Kabbalistic idea and Hasidic, lifting a spark up to its root in the highest levels. At the highest levels, it's part of God's unity, no matter what it is. Otherwise, it couldn't exist in this world. So when we lift that up, the spark of Amalek, its essence becomes necessary, not something to be destroyed, but something to be made holy. And that requires taking a perspective that goes above the heavens to see that higher reality.
And that's not our
so, what's that?
That's not our reshus.
Say that again?
That's not our reshus. Lo b'shamayim hi. So it's none of our business to...
Well, from Rav Kook's perspective, it is our business if it's necessary to annul a genocidal commandment.
Beneath the heavens, under the firmament, but tactone, but not elyonim.
No, but Rav Kook said the opposite. That's the point.
Really? Wow.
But specifically because that's the way to undo this harmful commandment.
From the root.
Yeah, is to undo it in that way. Deborah Cohen is saying this conversation is reminding me about the notion that some of these texts are reactions to trauma.
Oh, okay.
And I think that's important to think about.
Yeah.
And G says the Midianites are not attacking as the Amalekites, they are seducing, which is a good point, because there's a lot of ways to ethically make sense of not the actual doing of a genocide, but the commandments about wiping out Amalek, which can mean wiping out their culture of killing.
Did you say that again? You froze.
Sure. And it says my internet connection is unstable. Have I been freezing other times, or is this okay?
No, just this one.
Okay.
Just on a
Baruch Hashem.
word.
There's an argument to be made that what destroying Amalek means destroying a culture that was, the ways presented in rabbinic interpretation, itself genocidal. And so you have to wipe out that culture. The Midianite situation is that the Midianites are seducing the Israelites. That happens in which parsha? It's like in the next few weeks, I think, or maybe even next week. Does anyone remember what parsha it's in?
End of Balak.
It's in Balak or the one after Balak? And where does Balak come after? Last week was Naso.
We've got Shalach, then Korach, and then Chukat Balak, I think.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we got some 5 weeks there.
Balak.
Well, last week was Bahalotcha, not Naso.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Maftir,
Anyway, it's coming up soonish. Yeah, and that's an issue of seduction. So in what way can you say the Midianites seduced us, so we should wipe them out? Like wipe out the people who were seduced, if you're going to have to wipe anyone out, you might say. But then that leads us to Pinchas, of course, right, Gio? Because Pinchas is the one who wipes out the one who was seduced, as well as seductress.
The seduced smacks a bit of blaming the victim.
It does. But in this case, you have the Israelite man being seduced by the Midianite woman. And so we get into the gender of it, which reverses that.
Well, and there's the whole Jezebel stuff and,
Yes.
other issue on the power of women or women in powerful places.
Yes. But now, did anyone else want to bring up any other text that they just can't live with in their apparent meaning?
What about the Maccabees and that was left out?
You object to it being left out, or you're glad it was left out?
Well, I don't know. I'm confused about it. But the fact that the Maccabees was mayhem and it was Jews hurting Jews, so it wasn't put in as an example, but it wasn't explained either.
You mean not codifying everything because some of it's yucky?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, definitely.
I mean,
in the list of forbidden relationships, it never spells out that a man cannot take his daughter. So, of course, the rabbis generalize from the list of forbidden relationships that a man can't have sexual relationships with his daughter, but that's not spelled out in the Torah.
Well, that's an interesting point that I never thought of, I have to say.
I
mean, it does say that you can have sexual relations with a woman, with two women that are mother-daughter relationship or sister relationship. So that would imply that, but you would think that would be maybe more of an upfront point to make, don't you?
yeah.
It is inferable by logic without needing rabbinic fancy work.
Well, so they say.
No, I just made the
Yeah,
syllogism
I mean,
right there.
Yeah. No, I mean, because one of the, rules of Torah, in the Birnbaum Siddur, they have this long list, maybe it's from Maimonides, about how you are supposed to study and interpret Torah. I'm trying to remember what he says, or if in that list it talks about what's left out and what you can learn from what's left out. But certainly a lot of interpretation is done around what's left out.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Let's go back to our main subject. Everyone's cool with that.
Thank you. Thank you for the detour.
Let's see, what do I want to... Am I in the right chapter here? Yes. No, I accidentally went back to the wrong chapter. Here, let me get back up to where I want to go. We're going to touch on some of the Kabbalistic texts that actually say this idea explicitly, that the creation is the image of God. So where is that? Where did I put that? Oh, the world is God's image. Okay. Now these texts, by the way, are complicated, meaning they're a little bit hard to parse in the Hebrew. This series of texts come from Yosef ben Shalom Ashkenazi, and he wrote a commentary on Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, the one of the earlier midrashim on the book of Genesis. So just to put things in place historically, the first midrashim that are written are the ones about halacha, that deal with issues of law. Because Genesis doesn't have much law in it, it's the last one to get a midrash. And it's the first one that's considered Midrash Agadah versus Midrash Halacha. So Midrash Halacha is Mechilta, Sifrei Devarim, Sifrei B'midbar, Torah Kohanim, which is on Vayikra, Leviticus. After all that gets written down, then we have Bereshit Rabbah gets written down, which we're talking about 4th, 5th century. So still pretty early. Yeah. So that was a book that dealt in detail with the story of creation. And then Yosef ben Shalom Ashkenazi in the 13th or 14th century, we don't know exactly when he lived, wrote his commentary on this book. Got it? Just a little picture. So we're just going to look at a few of his texts here, and then we'll start winding up, and then I'll just go over briefly what we're going to focus on next week. Okay? So, in order for Adam to be ordered within and without in the image of the whole world and its guide in the absolute intellect, meaning God, right? Scripture said, Bitsalmenu, in our image, to indicate that we're in two images, one being the world and one being the divine intellect. To hint at the image, the dimyon of the one who guides, and the structure, and the dimyon, and the demut, and the dimyon of the structure. I'll keep over scrolling here. What did I do here? Oh yeah, no. Oh, because I went one page hard. Pardon me, everyone. I can use this little arrow and that will work better. And the image of the worlds and the 10 sefirot and their details. Therefore, the human is called a small world. So in this text, we have two images in us. One is the image of creation and one is the image of God. It doesn't say that these are the same image or that creation is in the image of God, but it kind of sets up the framework. The next one we have, the Adam should be called an olam katan, a small universe, a microcosm, for his form resembles all the existences of the universe. So the human formed of the ground, the dirt of the ground included in him to become his seal, right, and structure and demut and selam, to become in him the seal, structure, demut, and selam of all the 10 sefirot and all that is created and formed and made from them. So everything that's created and formed and made from them includes the physical heavens and the physical earth. And the sefirot themselves are the image of God, according to Kabbalah. So now here he's bringing these two together, again, in a kind of subtle way. But he's bringing these two together, but he's also saying that everything included in the human that's formed from the dirt, so we're talking about the tachtonim, right, has seal, structure, demut, and selam. So these are all different words for the image of God. This is the principle that should be grasped in your hands. This is a different book, by the way. This is his commentary on Sefer Yetzirah. All the existences which have in them the 10 sefirot become ordered, right, or misader, or constructed through the joining of the letters. And it doesn't matter whether they're rock or vegetable or mineral or animal or human, right? Whether silent, growing, moving, or speaking. Each one is in the structure of God's seal. This God's seal is, of course, chotmo, which means chotam is another word meaning tselem in rabbinic terminology. Understand this, for it hints towards the truth. It says, let us make the human in our image as our likeness. And it says, Yismecha Shamayim v'tagel haaretz. The heavens rejoiced and the earth sang out. the first letters of this verse, right? Yismucho shamayim v'tagel haaretz, spell out Yud Hey Vav Hey. See that? And the last letters, the Aretz is Tzadi, Tagel is Lamed, Hashamayim is Mem, Yismichu is Vav. Spell out Salmo, God's image. So God's image is the heavens and the earth, but it's specifically the heavens and the earth in the state of rejoicing that are the image of God. And when God says, let us make the human in our image as our likeness, this means that God is saying to the universe, let's make the human in the image of you, which is also my image. So here the two are equated in a way that they weren't in the previous texts, even though they're all from the same author. And then he ends with a quote from Bereshit Rabbah. Olam Maleh, Shem Maleh, a full name for an Olam Maleh, a full world. Does anyone know what that refers to? I'd be happy to tell you, but does anyone know offhand what that midrash is referring to? So in chapter 1, the name for God used is Elohim, right? Just meaning God. It's actually a plural word. It actually means gods, except we use singular verbs to conjugate it with. Very interesting and complex, but not the subject of the moment. In chapter 2, the name of God changes from Elohim to Hamonai Elohim. Now, I'm being a little over pious. It's Adonai Elohim, right? Without the carefulness about saying God's name. But I prefer to keep God's name sacred by not saying it willy-nilly. In the Ashkenazi world, you say Adoshem sometimes, if you don't want to say Adonai. In the Sephardi world, you say Hamonai instead of Adonai. So Hamonai Elohim. Anyway, it uses this full name of God. The full name is both Yud Hey Vav Hey and the other name, the name that means God. Together, that's a full name. So what it's saying is that the creation was not full, and therefore, God was not full. God could not be fully God. God could not be given God's full name until there was a full creation for God to be in relationship to. And this full creation is the creation that's the image of God. So in a way, gets complicated hermeneutically quite a bit. In a way, because the universe embodies Yod Hey Vav Hey, embodies this name of God which has not been used until there's a creation, only then can God have the name Yod Hey Vav Hey. So it's not just that God isn't revealed as Yod Hey Vav Hey, it's that God isn't Yod Hey Vav Hey until there's a creation that's also Yod Hey Vav Hey. And then at that climax of creation, God says to the world, let us make the image that is both of our images, the Yod Hey Vav Hey, and put it in the human. There's a problem here, by the way, which I'm not sure if anyone noticed so far, because it says that we're in the image of Elohim. It doesn't say we're in the image of Yod Hey Vav Hey in the Torah. He doesn't deal with that here. He does try to deal with that in other places, but I'm not going to go into that right now because it's not in this chapter. But it creates a problem that he's not worried about in this particular passage, which is, why does it say that we are in the image of Elohim and not in the image of Yod Hey Vav Hey? It's not a problem if you believe in the documentary hypothesis and say that different parts of the Torah were written by different people, then it's a simple explanation. The people that thought we were in God's image didn't have the idea of Yod Hey Vav Hey as being the name for God. That's a simple way to explain it. But that's not how we do things in Judaism. We try to make it all make sense together. Right? So how do you make it make sense? That is for another class.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah, it's a great text. I'll tell you, I was so excited when I found that text. It's just an amazing passage. So we have more to do in chapter 9, not a huge amount. And chapter 10, well, that's not entirely true. We have a huge amount because we have the whole thing about Or Choser.
Mhm.
which starts here, I'm scrolling to it, which starts on page, yeah. Yeah, page 254. Is that right? No, 255.
255.
255. So next week, we're going to do 255, that section on Or Choser, which is extraordinary. And I think we're going to be able to finish chapter 10, but we'll see. Chapter 10 is focusing on the idea of Gaia. How do you relate all this to a more directly scientific and or ecological understanding of the wholeness of creation? And specifically, we're going to focus, that chapter focuses on Maimonides. And we have talked a fair amount on more than one occasion about those texts in Maimonides. So probably we'll be able to do that whole chapter next week. We'll see. I'm not sure, but we'll see how it goes. Any reflections before we end today? Did you want to say something, Rita? No, okay. You don't have to have reflections, but you might. Okay. So let's do a nigun to end, okay? Which one do I want to do? You want simple or harder? Complex, more complex.
Simple.
Simple,
What's that?
please.
Simple.
Simple? Okay. Okay, we'll go simple. Yada, 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 yada. Yada, 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 Okay, everyone. Thanks for the time,
Thank you.
attention, the discussion, and we'll see you in a week. And feel free, by the way, if you want to use the Gmail, the Google group list. Deborah, you wrote something to the Google group list too. I've been using it for announcements, but it's fine to initiate discussions there too if you want, related to the class. Okay.
I still didn't get in there. It said I couldn't get in, so I have to figure out.
I should be able to try to add you directly, so I will do that right now, because if I don't do it right now, I will forget.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.